have in my hands a copy of a bowl that you'll find in Delphi in the museum, and it represents a significant departure from the usual style of Greek ornamentation. It's given a white background and the figure of Apollo has been painted on in black. It's different in the sense that until then most of the pottery was done in the famous red and black style. Now in this you can see Apollo playing the lyre. Remember, he was the patron god of music. We're going to conclude our study at Delphi with a look at the origins of Western music. Now, to begin with, we need to just move away from the site of Delphi to Italy, in fact, where Pythagoras lived for a considerable period of his life. Pythagoras was a Greek who was born on the island of Samos, and everyone associates Pythagoras' name with the famous a squared plus b squared equals c squared of right-angled triangles. He provided one of the first proofs of the generality of that rule. Pythagoras also did a great deal of research into notes that are sounded on the lyre or harp and on the flute, the two main Greek instruments, or I should say there was a third instrument very similar to the reed of an oboe, produced a piercing sound. However, on the strings of the lyre, Pythagoras was able to deduce certain mathematical relationships between the length of the string, how taut it was, and the sounds of the notes that were produced. He got the idea for this from walking past the blacksmith's shops, and he'd hear the sounds, the ringing sounds produced by the hammers on the anvil, and he noted that the weight of the hammer had a great deal to do with the sound of the note that was produced. I'd like to move through now into the room with piano, and we're going to introduce international music educator Stuart Manins. He's going to take us through some of the background material to the rise of Western music. And we're just going to play around now and see whether we can recreate and rediscover the kinds of experiments that Pythagoras did that gave rise to Western music. Over to you, Stuart.
Sure. Well, if I play this note here, which is C, 2 octaves below middle C, I can find strings vibrating. Yeah? I've stopped them with my finger. Actually, there are 2 C strings in there. Let's think of one vibrating and imagine what Pythagoras discovered. As the string vibrated from side to side over its length, which is about 1 metre.
About the size of a cello.
That's right, your cello bottom string. As it vibrated like that, it produced a number of vibrations per second. We call these hertz, or vibrations per second. He then noticed that it not only vibrated across its total length, but immediately it started doing that, it vibrated in halves.
Exact halves?
Exact halves.
And that gave rise to a new musical note.
Well, it's a different note, but it's not different enough to have another name. If that's C, the note that came out of that experiment was the C above. Still has the same name.
They're not different notes, are they? They are somehow very intimately connected.
They are, and the connection is this simple ratio of 2 to 1.
There must have been other ratios that he observed.
There were. Okay, so there's the first, 2 to 1. He then, when he noticed the string, as it was vibrating in halves, also vibrated in thirds along those halves. And the note that came out, that he had heard from the hammers and the anvil,
that note is what I would call a G.
That's right. Yeah.
Now,
and that's a fifth above the C's.
What,
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 notes, so it's called a fifth.
It's vibrating in thirds, but it actually gives rise to 5 steps.
That's right. That's right.
That's rather interesting. What happens if well, what would be the next note in that sequence?
Right, go back to the beginning there. 2 to 1 gives the octave. 3 to 2 gives the fifth. 4 to 2.
Oh, that'll give rise to an octave because that's a halving.
That's right. And then 5 to 4 gives the third.
A third being 3 steps apart.
Da da da, 1, 2, 3.
It's a very interesting note when you sound the third, isn't it?
Yes.
The fifth is quite strong.
Very strong, yes.
The third has some, I can't quite define what it is. How would you decide?
The fifth is determined and fixed by acoustics.
Right.
But you can have many kinds of thirds in there. You can have, and they didn't know this, we know this now. There was a minor third, there's a major third. The Arabs actually had, in the Middle Ages, a neutral third.
And where would that sound?
In the cracks. That's very much like jazz performance, where you do that kind of thing in jazz.
Well, Greek singing back in the time of Pythagoras must have been very rich then, because they had all these intervals that we seem to have on the piano.
Well, they had them as intervals, not as chords, and that's the big difference.
Do you mean by that they were somehow running a melody as if it were a horizontal, but they never actually sounded notes together?
Well, only accidentally. And later on, when they recognised them accidentally, they called them discords, and they had to be resolved. They weren't proper.
So, Greek singing would have been in octaves?
Yes.
Like,
yes.
So.
And it took some hundreds of years for the influence of that on the early church, for that to be called magadizing, where they recognised that that was the same tune, but sung an octave away. And that name was only recognised in Latin church music, as distinct from Jewish music or Byzantine music.
I seem to recall that at certain stages in church history, some music was banned, or some intervals were banned from church music.
Well, that's another matter. We have been talking about the influence of Pythagoras' scale on singing melodies. It wasn't until the Latin church had recognised magadizing, singing in unison.
Right.
I mean, they've done it, but they recognised
they formally understood what they did.
And they justified it as being very, very good because it was based on the mathematical relationship of 2 to 1.
And there is a perfection in this relationship,
and
it reflects the perfection of God.
Okay. Now it's interesting that the next interval to be added to that was the fifth. And for example, in singing Amen, if I go Amen, which is a kind of way of singing that was quite well known.
It was a nice way of bringing things to a close, wasn't it?
Right, yes. But you could get this, and I'll have to play the other part.
Yes.
Amen. Now that's not strictly in tune because the piano is differently tuned from natural temperament. That's another whole matter, but it's pretty close, and you got the idea of it. Now, the fifth interval came from the third division of the string.
Right.
And I imagine that was acceptable at first because 3 was the number of the Trinity.
Oh, okay.
You have to understand these things.
The symbolism is always there.
Always there. Right. Now you said there were some, and you rightly said, there were some intervals that were considered inappropriate. And you've guessed it, it's the next in the series. It goes from, is the third.
And this is the chord that, this is the interval that was banned by the church.
That's right. That's right.
So all the music that we sing in church today is based on triads like that, or the minor.
That's right, yeah.
But for a long time, this was simply not allowed to be sung.
That's right.
And the reason was why?
Well, one pope is recorded to have said that the addition of the third gave a sensual, not sensuous, but a sensual quality to the sound. So it was sexy, promiscuous.
And
Very,
so
very bad.
most of our churches today, when they sing their Victorian hymns, are actually being extremely sexy
That's right.
in terms of how
That's
medieval
right.
Pope would have
Yeah.
seen church music.
Had you not noticed this?
With all due respect, no.